In this episode, we are moving into one of the most important foundation topics in the entire CRISC journey, because a lot of risk conversations only make sense after you understand the basic ideas that information security is built on. For a brand new learner, the phrase information security can sound broad enough to mean almost anything involving computers, passwords, and hackers, but it is much more structured than that. Information security is really about protecting information and the systems that handle it in ways that support the organization's mission, preserve trust, and reduce harmful disruption. That means keeping data and systems protected not only from criminal activity, but also from mistakes, misuse, poor design, equipment failure, and weak decision-making. Once you see that bigger picture, frameworks and standards start to make more sense as well, because they exist to help organizations approach security in a repeatable, understandable, and defensible way instead of relying on guesswork, heroics, or disconnected technical fixes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is with the idea that security is not the same thing as secrecy. Many beginners assume information security is mostly about hiding data so nobody can see it, but that is only part of the story. Organizations also need to make sure information remains accurate, remains available when needed, and remains usable by the right people at the right time. This is why one of the most basic concepts in the field is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. Confidentiality means information is protected from unauthorized disclosure. Integrity means information is accurate and trustworthy. And availability means systems and data are accessible when needed for legitimate business purposes. That simple model helps explain why security decisions are often about balance rather than extremes. Because locking everything down so tightly that nobody can do their jobs may protect confidentiality while harming availability, and fast, easy access without enough control may help availability while damaging confidentiality or integrity. Once the CIA idea is clear, the next step is understanding that information security exists to support the business, not to stand apart from it. Security is sometimes described in ways that make it sound like a separate technical world with its own language and priorities, but in real organizations it is deeply connected to daily operations, customer trust, legal obligations, reputation, and long-term resilience. A hospital depends on secure and available information for patient care, a bank depends on it for transactions and trust, a manufacturer depends on it for production continuity, and a school depends on it for records, learning systems, and privacy. The controls may differ across those environments, but the principle is the same. Security protects the information and processes that allow the organization to function. That is why risk professionals do not look only at firewalls, passwords, and alerts. They also look at business services, decision-making, ownership, dependencies, and the possible consequences when information is exposed, altered, lost, or made unavailable. That leads naturally into another essential concept, which is that security is not just about technology. New learners often picture security as a set of software tools or technical defenses, but people and processes matter just as much. An organization can buy strong technology and still have weak security if employees do not understand their responsibilities, if leaders do not set priorities clearly, or if basic business processes create avoidable exposure. A careless data handling practice, a weak approval process, or unclear ownership of a critical system can create just as much risk as a missing technical control. This is why mature security programs usually talk about people, processes, and technology together. Technology can enforce controls and create visibility, but people decide how systems are used and processes determine whether the organization behaves consistently. When CRISC looks at information security, it is looking at this broader operating environment where human choices, business routines, and technical design all combine to shape risk. Another core concept is that information has different value and sensitivity depending on what it is, how it is used, and what would happen if something went wrong. Not every file, database, or record deserves the same handling, and treating all information exactly the same often creates waste in one place and weakness in another. Customer payment data, employee records, business strategy documents, public website content, and marketing graphics all carry different consequences if they are exposed, altered, or destroyed. This means organizations need ways to understand which information matters most and why. Classification, ownership, retention, and handling rules all flow from that basic understanding. Without it, security becomes inconsistent because people make ad hoc decisions based on convenience rather than business need. A beginner should keep in mind that security becomes much more practical when the organization can say what information it has, how important it is, who is responsible for it, and what level of protection is appropriate for that kind of data. Access control is another major concept because protecting information depends heavily on deciding who should be able to use it and under what conditions. This includes users, administrators, applications, vendors, and automated processes, all of which may need different levels of access. A very common beginner mistake is to think good security means simply giving or denying access, but real access control is more nuanced than that. The organization needs to match access to business need, remove access that is no longer justified, and reduce the chance that one account can do far more than it should. This is where ideas such as identity management, segregation of duties, review of privileges, and role-based access become important. Good access control protects confidentiality and integrity, but it also supports accountability because the organization can better understand who did what and whether that access made sense. In risk terms, access is a powerful control point because too much access creates exposure and too little access can create operational failure. As security programs mature, they also rely on preventive, detective, and corrective controls, and it helps to understand what each of those means at a high level. Preventive controls are meant to stop a bad outcome before it happens, such as access restrictions, configuration standards, or awareness training that reduces careless behavior. Detective controls are meant to identify that something has happened or is happening, such as logging, monitoring, alerting, or review processes that reveal unusual activity. Corrective controls are meant to restore order or reduce harm after a problem occurs, such as recovery procedures, account resets, or other actions that help the organization respond and return to acceptable operation. The reason this matters is that no organization can prevent every problem. A sound security approach accepts that some events will still occur and therefore uses a mix of controls to reduce likelihood, improve visibility, and support recovery. That layered thinking is one of the most practical concepts in information security because it reflects how real organizations operate under uncertainty. With those concepts in place, frameworks start to become easier to understand. A framework is not a product and not a single control. It is a structured way of organizing security work so the organization can think clearly about responsibilities, priorities, objectives, and improvement. Frameworks help leaders and practitioners avoid random activity by giving them a model for building or evaluating a security program. They can support governance, risk discussions, communication, maturity assessment, and planning across the enterprise. For a beginner, one of the biggest benefits of a framework is that it turns a very broad field into something more manageable. Instead of asking whether security is good or bad in a vague sense, the organization can ask whether it has defined processes, assigned ownership, covered major control areas, and aligned its work with recognized expectations. Frameworks do not remove the need for judgment, but they provide a common language that helps different teams discuss security in a more consistent and useful way. One well-known example is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which provides guidance that many organizations use to structure security thinking and improvement. Within that family, the Cybersecurity Framework, CSF, is especially useful because it organizes security activities into broad functions that are understandable even to people who are not deeply technical. It helps organizations think about identifying what they have, protecting what matters, detecting issues, responding to incidents, and recovering from disruption. The value of a model like that is not that it tells every organization to look identical. The value is that it creates a shared structure for discussion and planning. A school, manufacturer, hospital, or financial firm may all use the framework differently, but each can still benefit from the same broad logic. For CRISC learners, this matters because frameworks support the connection between business objectives and control planning, which is exactly where risk management needs strong structure. Another important example is the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, especially the security-related standards that organizations use to shape governance and control practices. These standards are often associated with formalized management approaches, documentation discipline, and the idea that security should be operated as a system rather than as a set of scattered technical tasks. A beginner does not need to memorize every clause to understand the bigger lesson. The main point is that standards can provide a recognized benchmark for what a well-organized program should address, from policy and asset management to incident handling and continuous improvement. Standards help organizations define expectations in a more formal and repeatable way, which can be helpful for internal discipline as well as external assurance. They do not guarantee that every security decision will be wise, but they help reduce chaos by setting out a clearer baseline for what should exist, how it should be reviewed, and how improvement should be sustained over time. A third example worth understanding is Control Objectives for Information and Related Technologies, COBIT, which is especially useful when the conversation moves closer to governance, control objectives, and alignment between technology and business goals. COBIT helps organizations think about how information and technology should be governed and managed so that value is delivered while risk is controlled and resources are used responsibly. For a CRISC learner, that is very relevant because risk work often lives in the space between operational reality and leadership expectations. Frameworks like COBIT help translate security and control concerns into a language executives and governance bodies can work with. That means the discussion is not limited to whether a specific technical defense is present. It also includes whether decision rights are clear, whether performance is measured, whether ownership exists, and whether risk is being monitored in a structured way. In short, frameworks help organizations elevate security from a narrow technical topic to a broader management and governance discipline. At this point, it is useful to separate frameworks from standards because the two terms are related but not identical. A framework generally provides a structure or model for organizing work, while a standard tends to be more specific about required or expected practices. Another way to think about it is that frameworks often help you understand the shape of a good program, while standards help define what acceptable practice should look like in more concrete terms. In real organizations, the boundary is not always perfectly neat, and people sometimes use the terms loosely, but the distinction is still helpful. A framework can guide priorities and maturity discussions, while a standard can establish baseline expectations for how systems, processes, or controls should be implemented and maintained. Both are useful because organizations need structure and detail. They need a map for the bigger journey, and they also need clearer expectations for daily behavior, design choices, and control operation. Policies, procedures, baselines, and guidelines all connect to this discussion as well, because frameworks and standards only become meaningful when the organization turns them into daily operating habits. A policy states what the organization expects at a high level, such as protecting sensitive information or controlling access based on business need. Procedures describe how people will actually carry out those expectations in practice. Baselines define minimum acceptable configurations or security conditions, and guidelines offer recommended approaches where flexibility is still appropriate. This matters because many beginners hear about frameworks and standards and imagine that buying a book or declaring alignment is enough. It is not. Security becomes real when high-level expectations are translated into repeatable actions, reviewed over time, and supported by leadership. If that translation never happens, frameworks remain abstract and standards remain paperwork. The practical lesson is that information security succeeds when strategic direction, formal expectations, and day-to-day operations all connect in a coherent and understandable way. It is also important to understand that information security is not static. Threats evolve, business models change, regulations shift, technologies age, and organizations adopt new tools faster than they update their controls. Because of that, frameworks and standards should not be treated as one-time projects with permanent completion dates. They are part of an ongoing cycle of assessment, improvement, monitoring, and adjustment. This is one reason why security maturity matters so much. A less mature organization may have some controls in place but operate inconsistently, with unclear ownership or weak measurement. A more mature organization tends to be more deliberate, more repeatable, and better able to explain how security supports the business while reducing exposure. For CRISC learners, this is an essential insight because the role is not only to identify risk once. It is to help the organization understand whether its current approach remains adequate as the environment changes and whether gaps between expectation and reality are growing or shrinking. When you bring all of this together, information security concepts, frameworks, and standards start to look less like isolated vocabulary terms and more like pieces of one connected system. The concepts explain what security is trying to protect and why that protection matters. Frameworks provide a structure for organizing the work and communicating priorities in a common language. Standards establish more specific expectations so that protection is not left entirely to personal preference or inconsistent local decisions. For a beginner, the most important takeaway is that strong information security does not come from a single tool, a single policy, or a single audit result. It comes from understanding what matters, applying recognized structure, translating that structure into practical controls, and improving over time as the organization and its risks continue to change. Once that foundation is clear, the rest of CRISC becomes easier to understand because you can see how risk, governance, control, and business value all connect through the discipline of information security.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.